Coming up on Dialogue Weekend, Tesla and major car makers sue the Trump administration over tariffs on Chinese car parts. Leaders in Europe and Canada issue warnings of a second wave of coronavirus. Is the world ready to face it? And this week's newsmaker. Now, on Dialogue Weekend.
Welcome to Dialogue Weekend. I'm Xu Jiandu. Four prominent car makers are launching lawsuits against the U.S. government for its high tariffs on imports from China. Tesla, Volvo, Ford, and Mercedes-Benz are fighting to put an end to what they call unlawful 25% tariffs on certain auto parts they import for their U.S.-based production line from China. Tesla's filing to the Court of International Trade says the levies were arbitrary, capricious, and abuse of discretion. Mercedes accused the Trump administration of prosecution of an unprecedented, unbounded, and unlimited trade war impacting over $500 billion in imports from the People's Republic of China. To talk more about the U.S. tariffs' impact on the auto sector and beyond, we have Liu Zhiqian, Senior Fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at the Renmin University of China, Professor Jeffrey Towson, host of Jeff's Asia Tech class. So welcome to the show, gentlemen. So Professor Liu Zhiqian, I start with you. Why are Tesla, Volvo, Ford, and Mercedes-Benz here filing the lawsuit at this particular point of time against the U.S. government?
I think this is not a surprising news for us because we have already known that some major car makers in the world are trying in some years that to lawsuit the U.S. government, because we know that all the U.S. government has taken wrong steps, the wrong measures that to safeguard its own interest by demonstrating their hegemony that over the trade issues. So in this way, that all these car makers in the world, they have already suffered heavy losses in the past years, especially in the past 2 years, due to the tariffs imposed on China. We know that last year some car makers that already tried to argue with the government to have the special relief or special treatment on their products imported from China, because all these products they imported from China are really in the interest of the car makers. They safeguard also the interest of the customers in the United States. But the U.S. trade representative is very tough. They have no room, no space, no intention that even to negotiate with these car makers. So in this way, that they have no way out for these manufacturers, that they have to put their interest in the priority to safeguard the interests of the customers, especially the market in the United States. So that's why we see at this time that all these car makers filing the lawsuit against the U.S. government. I think the time is not too early. It's already too late to have such a lawsuit. Otherwise, they can already safeguard their own interests long before, even 1 year before. Mm-hmm. So in this way, we should see that further steps will be taken by the car makers that to further improve, especially to push the negotiations with the U.S. representatives in trade affairs. So that's why the whole world now is looking very closely at the procedures and what the outcome will come from these lawsuits. We hope that we can have very positive result.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor Towson, also this week, along with these four companies, actually there are, if I'm not mistaken, like thousands of lawsuits or companies are filing lawsuits against the Trump administration for the actual tariffs put on the imports from China. So it seems to me, of course, there's a time issue, but also, what do you make of these moves, at this particular point of time?
Yeah, I mean, it's not uncommon, and it's actually kind of a good thing. We like, I'm American, we like it when companies sue the government and things like that. So you know, good for them for standing up and filing suit and going to court and arguing. Most of what I've read about their lawsuits, it seems to be more of a process argument, that you didn't go through the right steps and give time for public, you know, response and things like that, as opposed to the idea that the U.S. government doesn't have the authority to set tariffs, which I think most people believe they do. So this was more of a process argument, but good for them. And you know, I think Trump actually, before he got to become the president, I think he actually held the record for the individual or company most sued or involved in lawsuits. It's something like 1,000 lawsuits that guy's been involved in. So this is kind of a normal day for him. I don't think it's anything huge on his side.
Well, that's a lot of work to deal with in the court too, probably. So Professor Liu here, last year, as you said, you know, Tesla asked for relief, you know, for 25%. Okay, we will continue with Professor Towson here. 25% tariff on the Model 3 car computer and the display screen, but the argument given by the government side is like, well, the imports is really about the Chinese technology, which is important to China's national security program. I wonder, so what do you think of the government's, you know, national security argument here? You know, for a lot of people, we know that the trade war was launched originally to reduce or for reducing this trade deficit U.S. has with the Chinese side. So now we have this another argument about national security. Are you surprised with that, Professor Towson?
I think almost immediately, I mean, this began as a trade argument. And, you know, as you rightly say, it started out with the idea of a trade deficit. That was the issue that was brought up, mostly by President Trump. And then very quickly, it kind of became a tech issue, where it was like, you know, we don't like that certain things are going here. And then it became kind of national security. And as far as I can tell, Tesla's main issue is that it's sourcing computers and screens from China, and they don't have a lot of sources for those. And that's the issue that fell under this national security idea. So there's kind of a couple issues mixed in here. I mean, generally speaking, the U.S. government, especially the executive branch, has a lot more latitude to act if something becomes a national security issue. So that might, to some degree, be a go-to mechanism for doing things. But yeah, these things are all mixed together. So we'll see what the primary issue from the U.S. government really is. Was it the trade deficit? Was it national security? Was it strategic technology? We'll see where their priorities really are.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, speaking of national security, it seems to some people, at least here in China, you know, like there's, you know, what's the word like to use, or overuse, abuse of the concept of national security. For example, you know, there's the latest report about young Chinese students who spend basically seven years in the U.S., starting from senior high and to university. And because he leaves his permanent address in so-called like you know, in the campus of a Chinese Defense University, that's where he went to kindergarten and primary school. Probably that's the only reason, because his grandfather, grandmother were professors in that university. So his you know, like visa was basically eradicated by the U.S. government over there. And later on, that was corrected, but still he was you know, sort of like very much concerned and refused to go back to the U.S. So I'm wondering here in the tech sector, in the trade sector, Professor Liu, do you see there's a, you know, probably overuse of the concept of national security? For example, the import of Chinese display screen or you know, computer for Tesla Model 3?
You know, this is a very fantastic argument for the U.S. government. They always talking about the national security issue. National security is a universal common sense for all countries who are really intended to safeguard their own interest. But now the U.S. government has already go to the extremist idea that they use the national security as their tool that to govern all the issues all over the world, even try to have a long-arm jurisdiction that over other countries. So in this way, national security is no more so serious, is no more so honest, is no more so impractical. They only become a political tool, especially for the Chinese products. We cannot imagine that they can say that the spare parts from China can harm the security in the United States. They even blame same security problem with the German car producers and also other parts of all over the world. So even when we made such a joke with some American friend, we said, maybe next year your governor or your president will say Chinese chopstick is also a threat to the national security. We should not import the Chinese food, the Chinese chopstick. So in this way, I have to say that the U.S. government should change their fundamental idea, that they should come to the ground to see what the really people are thinking, are talking about, they are wishing. That there is no reason, no ground to be fearing about the so-called national security, because national security is very narrow-minded. If only we can talk about the so-called terrorism is a threat to the national security, but the normal business activities should never be regarded as a threat to national security. All countries should not do this.
Well, after all, trade is by nature, mutually beneficial for both parties. Let's move on to another issue that's also affecting the global economic performance. After successfully slowing outbreaks early in the year, countries in the northern hemisphere in particular, those in Europe, for example, are facing a resurgence in COVID-19 cases, the so-called second wave of infections. In fact, some countries are already recording their highest number of cases with winter around the corner and the season for flu is coming. Will we witness a worse situation than earlier this year, or are we better equipped to cope with a second wave with the practice of wearing a mask, social distancing, and the possible deployment of vaccines? So we are joined by Professor Joe Toker from the American Graduate School in Paris to talk more about that. So Spain, France, and the UK are already having a second wave, according to their government of COVID-19. So Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also said that Canada is in the second wave that could be worse than the first wave. So Professor Toker, who else is facing similar danger, and will the whole world somehow be hit by a second wave?
Well, the specialists here are somehow divided as for the right term of second wave. I don't believe that has an extreme importance whether you call it a second wave or whether you call it a serious extension of the first wave in terms of sanitary conditions and the social political atmosphere which is being dictated by those sanitary conditions. The definition of a second wave is really not very important. What is happening in Europe over the last 2 to 4 weeks is actually a clear aggravation of the sanitary statistics regarding tests, regarding the percentage of positive testing amongst the millions of tests which are being operated daily now all over the continent. So the major consideration of both the scientific and the political echelon is to make sure the moment which they are most scared about is about 3 weeks ahead of us, the mid-late October situation, in which the pessimistic provisions are afraid that the entire sanitary system and the hospital system would be actually flooded by a large number of hospitalization, including serious cases. So everything is done these days, let it be in France, in England, in Germany, in Switzerland, in Italy, in Spain and elsewhere, in order to avoid this crisis situation comes October. Whether that really happens, nobody really knows. Would the situation be as serious and as mortal as it was in March and April? Nobody really knows, although there are some reassuring signs as to the capacity of the hospital system to deal with the situation in a way more efficient way than during the winter and spring months behind us.
Well, Professor Coker here, as you said, because we are increasing our capacity to deal with for example, hospitalization, and also if you read the numbers, obviously fatalities are still well below their peak period of time in April, for example, and also probably, you know, mostly affected now are young people, so easier for them to recover. And we are better equipped in the sense, you know, with mask, with you know, social distancing. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, it does make sense, and all these parameters which you mentioned, which I mentioned a bit earlier, actually go the same way, which is, so to speak, the quote-unquote optimistic way in terms of organization of the sanitary authorities, hospitals, the experience which had been equipped during the winter and spring months, which give the it keeps at the hospital level well more experience and more efficiency regarding situation, even rough situations. Of course, the provision of and the hope for vaccine is there in the air all over the world, and we don't know whether that's going to catch up with the calendar I'm speaking about, which is that of October, November, and the fall. So you add up to that actually the age group which seems to hit these large statistics, high numbers of contamination, which is also in a way quote-unquote reassuring as we're speaking about, generally speaking, younger groups of the population. So you see all the elements actually go this way, except for one major consideration, which is that the virus is new, the virus we know is vicious, and the virus we know had already splashed the entire world with surprises, and those surprises were unpleasant. Will there be any more unpleasant surprises down the road over the weeks and months to come? This we do not know, unfortunately.
Well, Professor Towson, you know, usually according to the previous practice, you know, full national lockdown or partial lockdown was a common approach in the springtime. Are governments going to impose such a measure again, and, you know, given how economically devastating it could be?
Yeah, I think there is this idea that we can avoid this, or we can stop it at the border, or we can go home. And that doesn't look like a long-term strategy, because these things are kind of unpredictable. Viruses happen a lot. Sometimes you get a second wave. You don't know why you got the second wave. I think the attention is shifting, at least for business people, which is where I live, is focusing more on how do you manage this when it does happen, because you probably have to assume that it will. And that means, you know, closing the borders forever isn't going to work. You're going to have to open eventually. You know, everyone going back to work, we have to do that eventually. So how do you manage them when they emerge is probably, you know, where to focus. And it looks like everybody's getting better. The hospitals, the doctors, the population's much more savvy about this. The government knows what to do. Now, it's not such a panic situation like it was in March. Hospitals in particular are getting very good at dealing with this. So I think that's kind of what you can see going on now a bit in Western Europe, is a lot of sophistication in what to do.
Well, according to the UN, you know, the global economy will contract by 4.3% this year. If there's a second wave, you know, let's use this term to describe probably the resurgence of the cases in this season. So, you know, how do you balance between, on one hand, you want to protect the people, it's a public health issue. On the other hand, it's economic recovery. Some of the economy are in the process of recovering. And now, probably somehow you needed to impose a certain, you know, or sometimes quite restrictive measures on certain part of the country or even the whole country. You know, it's a difficult issue for governments, Professor Towson.
Yeah, I think the question is,
well,
what actually works?
Most probably the major element, the major vision which dictates the overall vision of West European and European governments as they try to find the best scenario to deal with what is going to happen over the coming weeks and months. How do you negotiate reasonable, relatively safe, and not as damageable scenario, recipe of overall treatment of this crisis, as you measure face-to-face the sanitary situation versus the economic one? Now, there is no one single equivalent solution that all European governments had adopted, and actually there's no real common policy within the European Union about it. But when you look at the way the French and the British and the Italian and the Spanish and the German government have behaved or count on behaving in the future, you find a major overall way of treatment, which consists of saying, first of all, everything should be done in order to avoid a complete lockdown. That's the worst. That's the worst, of course, in terms of the economic situation, but everybody's actually hoping that nothing in the sanitary situation would oblige governments to look back for solutions such as the full lockdown, the way it was actually applied for practically all European countries, with two exceptions, in March and April and later on. So that's the first major element. However, there are local solutions and local lockdowns which have already been applied, which are applied right now as we talk, and which will probably be more numerous. This is the case, for example, in Marseille, which is the second largest city in France, which is going to have over some neighborhoods sort of lockdown, and then of course all over the place in Europe you have more and more restrictions regarding economic life, regarding what can be done or cannot be done on the level of restaurants and bars and other actors regarding daily life. So the art of the matter is to negotiate specific conditions and specific restrictions regarding specific locations, and to try to keep it local without the obligation to come back to general solutions and, worst of all, general lockdown.
Well, let's leave it there for now and take a look at this week's Newsmaker. Joining me and Professor Toker is Julia Chapman, Moscow-based correspondent. So Alexander Lukashenko was sworn in to begin a new term as president of Belarus, despite all the protests and pressure from Western countries. So Julia, is that a sign that the country is coming back to calm and stability, or that is a sign somehow, you know, the so-called color revolution has ended in Belarus?
Well, the protesters are still taking to the streets today. We've seen a number of arrests going on. With regards to the term color revolution, that's a term that Alexander Lukashenko has used himself in a derogatory way, and he says that any such attempts have failed. But the protesters say they're not trying to hold a revolution. They just want Alexander Lukashenko to step down and for free and fair elections to be held. And despite the fact that his inauguration went on this week in secret, unannounced in advance, the protesters say they will not be backing down. They are still continuing to take to the streets, and they are taking to the streets today. There's a women's march happening in Minsk, and tomorrow protesters are going to be gathering in what they think are going to be very large numbers. Since the August 9th election, which was contested by the opposition, they say that Alexander Lukashenko did not win that vote, although the Central Election Commission has given him more than 80% of the votes. There have been big protests happening every day, but on Sundays is when the biggest numbers turn out, and the protesters are hoping that tomorrow, for what they're calling the people's inauguration, will show big, strong numbers in the face of Lukashenko.
Mm-hmm. Well, we don't know what's going to happen, like, to Lukashenko, but anyway, this is the 6th term of Lukashenko. So, Julia, in your point of view, why is he Lukashenko able to hold the Belarusian presidency for so long time, more than 20 years, 26, and how do people see his performance as the leader of the nation? Julia.
That's right. He was first elected in 19. He is now the he's the former Soviet Union's longest ruling leader in the post-Soviet era. He's managed to stay in power for a very long time. This is now his 6th term that he was inaugurated for last week, and he has been broadly very popular in the earlier years of his rule, and slowly though he managed to adapt the constitution to expand his powers. He's managed to maintain a very strong grip on the security services, which has really proven essential for him to stay in power during the protests that he's faced over the last weeks, because he still has the support of the security services, of the police, who have been detaining people in very high numbers and have allegedly been beating them and abusing them behind closed doors, in prison, where they've arrested a huge number of people. And so because he's managed to maintain that support, that essential support of the security services, he's managed to stay in power for quite a long time. And he's also managed to keep the economy relatively stable. So many Belarusians who do still support Alexander Lukashenko say that he is the leader that would give them stability, and has given them stability for the last 26 years. Nevertheless, many Belarusians we are seeing are still taking to the streets, calling for him to resign, saying he has been in power for too long and needs to step down and allow a new election.
Well, Professor Toker, the EU has said it does not recognize Lukashenko as the president of Belarus a day after he was sworn in for the 6th term. So what does that mean for Belarus, and what does that mean for the relationship between European Union and this country? Professor Toker.
Is the question put to me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, there is no one single approach amongst the members of the European Union regarding the crisis in Belarus. But let's state it right out loud. I mean, there is a large and clear and express discontent with the situation there. The key, I believe, in order to understand what is really happening in the EU position, but also in the Belarus position and in the objective position of the situation right now, is of course the Moscow one, is of course Putin, President Putin's positions. And this also conditions the way the European countries led by Germany. As you know, Germany is presiding the EU over this semester, and Chancellor Merkel had already talked to President Putin several times over the crisis. We know that these two have some special relations. I don't know whether they should be interpreted on the positive or negative sense in this context, although I don't really know what is precisely positive or negative context. But let's put it this way: the Europeans are discontent. The crisis is going on. The major key, in order to see which way it goes through Moscow, and the major issues which are relevant to what could happen between the EU and Russia in this context goes through Ukraine, another crisis. That's another ongoing situation. So you see the way all these different elements are actually packed up together in order to promise uncomfortable and problematic timetable and timeline of the crisis, which is well not behind us.
So basically it's the coordination, let's say, between Moscow and Brussels, Julia, very briefly. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I mean, Moscow will certainly be essential to whatever happens next in Belarus. Of course, Russia has been a backer of Alexander Lukashenko. Vladimir Putin congratulated him after he was re-elected in August, although he hasn't congratulated him on the inauguration that was held last week. And of course, Alexander Lukashenko did come to Russia a couple of weeks ago. He met Vladimir Putin in Sochi, and essentially was here asking for support from Putin to maintain that backing of him. So he is going to be essential to whatever comes next.
Sorry, we are running out of time. So with that, we are coming to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. And you can also watch us on the CGTN app or on the YouTube. I'm Xu Jianduo. Thank you for watching. See you next week.